235 continued in much the usual way for Scythia and her people. Settlement to the north, trade with the Armenians, and a Sarvan who's perpetually riding the steppe. Rathnakuda's youth had been spent in wife collecting and unequal wars against unprepared rivals. Now in his 40s, he sought, in his own peculiar way, a deeper meaning. He began to collect the statues and images of various gods and house them at the royal complex in Tafros, in a special temple called the Hadav Kodah, or the God Room. He began with the native gods of his people, namely Thagamisadas, the god of war, Tabiti, the god of wealth, Goitasiris, the god of culture, and Targateos, the god of fertility. Rathnakuda proclaimed that he was collecting gods, and not simply their statues, which is a sentiment that many dared not question him on. Still, he was not quite satisfied with this, especially when he commissioned the collection of foreign gods for his god room. The answer to satisfy his sudden and bizarre form of piety would continue to elude him for some time. By 231, in Gaul to the west, Santonia continued to grow, and was being centralized under their chief, Marganus, who sought to take notes from the civilized world and turn the sprawling tribal entity of Santonia into a kingdom. Santonia was hemmed in by the northern alliance of Treveria and Remia, both of whom also experienced noted growth during this time. Later that year, Macedon, under Basileus the Kyrgos Antigonid, constructed a wondrous temple at Olympus, which was the envy of the world. Rathnakuda, hearing of this feat, realized the answer to his restlessness. He needed not to simply collect gods. He needed truly to collect gods, meaning he would take gods away from other people, and with them, the sole and exclusive rights to their worship. He set his heart on conquering Olympia so as to steal all the gods of the Greeks and make them Scythian. He sent a foreboding omen to Macedon, namely a collection of 15 priests who arrived in the city of Olympia and sprinkled horse blood at the steps of the temple. However, these priests escaped before they could be apprehended, war did not come, and Rathnakuda would have to be content for now with the gods in his Hadav Kodah, given that Olympia was so distant and Macedon so powerful. As such, he turned his sight east once more, toward the Bosporan kingdom. He demanded of them Poseidon, knowing he was associated with horses. The Bosporans did not initially understand, and sent him a bronze statue of the god, which Rathnakuda stored away. A mutual misunderstanding took place, where Rathnakuda believed they had ceased their worship of the sea god forever, and ceded the rights to worship Poseidon to him and his people, while the Greeks believed that he just wanted a statue of the god. As such, some time passed without incident. That was until 228. During a visit to the royal complex at Tafros, he saw a Greek trader from the Bosporan kingdom saying a prayer to Poseidon to bless his ship. He seized him and interrogated him, asking him if he thought it was right to pray to his god since Poseidon lived in Scythia now. The merchant knew not how to respond, and was trampled to death by horses for his trouble. Rathnakuda then launched an invasion of the Bosporan kingdom, calling in their ally Armenia, launching the Third Greco-Scythian War. The Bosporans, once again caught off guard, were totally unprepared for a two-front war, Armenia conquering nearly the entire western half of the kingdom, flooding in with nearly endless men, and some of the finest siege engines this side of the Mediterranean. Scythia actually had some trouble breaking ground of their own in this regard, but nonetheless performed quite well in various encounters, like the Battle of Manar. The Greeks of Manar, cut off from the rest of the country and pinned against Scythia, sallied forth time and again to face the Scythians with their own cavalry. Under General Alexandros Doukas, the Greeks came charging out of their city as heavy cavalry, nearly impenetrable to the hails of arrows the Scythians were so fond of, carrying long, couched spears with heavy tips to skewer their opponents, or even their horses. These special units, called the Varies, were devastating to Scythian ranks and strategy, and even delivered 4 separate defeats to them. Finally, in 227, by adopting a similar unit to the Varyes, the Scythians were able to contest them in the field and conquer the city of Manar. It seemed to be over for the Bosporans, and Rath-Nakuda would win his god. However, everything changed in April of that year, when Basileus Antiochos II of the Seleucid Empire arrived on the border of Armenia, declaring war on her and her ally for the defense of Greek culture, and to press their claim on the entire Caucasus. Technically, they were joining independent of the Bosporans, but nonetheless they were co-belligerents, and the arrival of the world's premier empire could only help their chances of survival. This caught the dual alliance decidedly off guard, and their stance completely changed to counter the incoming threat. Armenian soldiers were redirected from their Bosporan offensives to many forts in the south, and the Scythian clans all went south, in an attempt to end the war with the Bosporans as quickly as possible, so the Seleucids could be dealt with. Soon enough, however, Macedon joined on the side of the Seleucids to humble what they saw as Eastern barbarians. In response to this, Egypt declared war upon Macedon, hoping that they would claim yet more European land, while the Greek kingdom was distracted by their war in the east. Coming full circle, this brought them into conflict with the Seleucids, who swore the defense of their fellow Greeks as part of their casus belli against Scythia and Armenia. This, in turn, split the Greek world, as the Egyptians were also Greek, bringing the Egyptian allies of Megalopolis, Andros, and Rhodes into the wider war. This would make the Third Greco-Scythian War the largest regional conflict of the century, and the outcome of this war would shape the character of the years to come in almost every respect. On the ground, the Scythian strategy worked like a charm, totally overwhelming the Bosporans, negotiating a separate peace, and relegating them to a minor strip along the Caspian Sea. However, even as Rath-Nakuda laid claim to the exclusive worship of Poseidon and had dozens of his statues carried off to Tafros, the celebration was very short-lived. And indeed, the unstable spark that began this war was considered of absolutely no consequence to anyone else, least of all the Greeks, who would go on worshipping their gods, unaware or uncaring for his strange demands of exclusive worship. The real war was only just beginning, and promised to churn up the status quo and lay down the foundations for something completely new. A paradigm upon which history will look with reverence, its permanent mandate shaping the nature of power for centuries to come. So, after the defeat of the Bosporans, Rath-Nakuda tasked his familial clan, the Agarids, to handle the chain of forts along the southern border with Armenia, tasked with defending Royal Scythia from Seleucid attacks. The rest of the clans, headed by the most loyal Datanpur, were sent west to carry out a major chain of attacks against the Macedonian colonies along the western shore of the Black Sea, namely Halmyrus, Libydia, and Scanopus. These cities fell in short order, as they lay far from the Macedonian heartland. However, this doesn't help in terms of the main conflict. Armenia, even with all her ascendant might, found itself unable to repel Seleucid incursions early in the war. Indeed, the only thing slowing them down was the mountainous Anatolian terrain, mountains that the Armenians knew well. Egypt also faltered against the Seleucids, who could match their chariot attacks for all their speed and strength with a near-endless supply of infantry, armed in gleaming bronze and iron. As such, Rath-Nakuda sent his familial clan south to help the Armenians in huge, pitched battles, like the Battle of Tigranikert on the 3rd of February 225, the largest battle yet recorded in the known world, with 70,000 men on either side. The strategies were simple, with Armenian siege weapons stationed behind the main force raining huge stones down upon the Greeks, Armenian heavy infantry forming an organized column in the center, and Scythian cavalry making up the flanking divisions, while a mix of Armenian and Scythian heavy cavalry surged forward to contest the field. Meanwhile, the Seleucids boasted a huge central column of infantry, with parallel spear divisions meant to prevent encirclement, and a detachment of war elephants, numbering perhaps 200, towering over the battlefield and lumbering inexorably towards the enemy. The fighting lasted a full 24 hours, but ultimately, the Scythians and Armenians were unable to hold back the human tide. The fighting broke down when an Armenian stone, launched over the battlefield, struck an elephant but did not kill it, sending it charging through the armored lines and crashing over the siege line. This separated the army in two, and resulted in two huge, hellish encirclements. Those of the Agrid clan that survived fled the battle, along with some Armenians. The Seleucids then went on a rampage, pillaging huge swaths of southern Armenia, which would go on for days before the armies began to move again. The Battle of Tigranikert claimed over 50,000 casualties and 90,000 when civilian deaths are included. It was a devastating loss and made it seem as though the war itself was fundamentally unwinnable. The Seleucids were too large, too numerous, too strong. Regardless, the fighting continued, with Armenia losing land only piece by piece from here on, with the direct help of Scythia, which harried the Seleucid men at every turn. This war would rage until 220 BC, when Armenia ran out of money and willpower to keep fighting, and the front collapsed. Ultimately, the Third Greco-Scythian War ended as such. The Seleucids carved out and annexed roughly a quarter of Armenian territory, completely altering the balance of power in Anatolia. Macedon made a white peace with Scythia and Armenia when it heard of the peace, establishing new trade deals with the Seleucids to divvy up stolen Armenian wealth. One unexpected outcome, however, was that Egypt managed to conquer the northern Levant, kicking out the Seleucids and marking the Egyptians as the dominant player of the eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Scythia was largely insulated from all this. The Seleucids had no contiguous claims and hadn't even crossed the Caucasus Mountains to get to them. The only prize taken from Scythia was ceremonial, and that is a letter proclaiming that the people belong to their gods, not the other way around. Quoting Antiochus, "The seed of this war was ridiculous. Poseidon's domain is the sea, and his people are the Greeks, not a clutch of savages drinking mare's milk in a dirty field." Rath-Nakuda did not take this kindly, and isolated himself in the royal complex for many months, fathering a total of 24 more children with 21 of his 64 wives, bringing his total progeny to a whopping 72, 49 of them sons. Scythia had been humbled, and now the fate of the nation lay adrift. The horse lords, the terror of the Greeks, were now shown their place in the world, and it wasn't anywhere near where they wanted it to be. The truth of the matter is that Royal Scythia is still a shadow of its former self, when all the Scythian tribes were one, and they dominated swaths of territory stretching from the Black Sea to the Himalayas. Whatever the case, history tells us that this temporary embarrassment is not water upon a flame, but instead, oil. The heart of noble Scythia doesn't take the insult of defeat with a timid bow. It takes it as the kindling for righteous revenge. No matter how dark things may seem, the steppe is still theirs, and their enemies are safe only behind their walls. As the Scythian people expand and multiply, who is to say how much longer those walls can really hold them back?